What was your scariest a second later and I would died moment? I cannot confirm whether this would have been death, however it would have changed my and my parents' life like death. I was about 6 or 7 and I went along with my mum to go train the new puppy we had. The training ground was quite far away from home and I remember that it was a big field surrounded by a forest and a motorway on the side of it. I was told to stay in the car and play on my Gamma Boy back when they were a thing lol. After an hour or so I got bored and I went to have a look at where my mum was with our puppy. The car park was a little while from the training ground, but I decided to walk towards her anyway. In the meantime an older man 30ish starts talking to me, and the naive little boy I talked back regardless of all the times my mum told me to not talk to strangers. He convinced me I was going the wrong way and told me he would take me to my mum and puppy house. We ended up by the motorway side and we were about to walk down the bank to the side of the motorway where his car was parked. As I'm about to disappear down the bank I hear the loudest scream of my name from my mum. I look back and feel the grip of the man tighten on my hand, but I was just in time to get my hand out of his grip and run towards my mother. My mum runs past me to see where this guy is, but he had just got into his car and drove off. To this day I still imagine about the what if scenario and how close I was to being kidnapped and potentially killed. A second doesn't really apply to my story, but about an hour does. When I was in 2nd grade my appendix swelled up and burst. I had severe pain for weeks while the doctors tried to figure out what was wrong. After staying at the hospital for some time, they suddenly said they needed to operate. They had finally figured out what was wrong and had to basically clean out my insides. Since it had burst quite some time ago, I was in a pretty critical state. If they hadn't realized soon after they did, I wouldn't be here. My sister went through something similar. I stayed up with her all night while she suffered through extreme nausea. Meanwhile, there was a blizzard going on outside. The next day, I went out on no sleep and helped my dad shovel while my mom was on the phone with the doctor. The first doctor said she could wait a day. The second said that if we had a vehicle that could manage the snow, we needed to get her in now. Turns out, she was septic. Her kidneys were shutting down. If my parents had waited out the storm, my sister would have died at 17 years old. Best the doctors could tell, her appendix had ruptured. In the aftermath, the whole thing caused her to develop pancreatitis, and she ended up staying in the hospital for a month until she was able to keep food down on her own again. When I was in middle school I called my mom on my cell during lunch because my head hurt so badly I couldn't move. She was on speed dial. Well, the nurse came and brought me to the office for a checkup and some pain pills. While I waited for my mom we didn't live close. Nurse said no fever and to take me home and put me to bed. My mom watched me get into the truck and decided that maybe we should go to the hospital to be safe. By the time we reached the hospital it was further than our home. My temp was at 104 and I was incapacitated. I had meningitis. If we went home and she put me to bed like the nurse suggested, I never would have woken up. For detail for those who keep asking, speculating it was viral meningitis, a less severe form, but it progressed very quickly. I had no headache when I arrived at school. By lunchtime I couldn't move on my own, and I couldn't see because light was too bright. The nurse came to get me, and I didn't have a fever. After waiting for my mom 10 minutes and the 20-minute drive to the hospital and 10-minute wait at the hospital, it was at 104. Yes, we told the nurse after, but there was only some of the symptoms. When I left school, she never gave me or my mother advice again, just told symptoms and gave pain meds. A friend asked for a ride on my motorcycle, so I let him wear the spare helmet and took him for seafood at Neptune's Net in Malibu. Some of the nearby beach houses have driveways that lead directly onto the highway. So while we were on the return trip back towards Santa Monica and South pulls onto my lane, there was absolutely no time to brake. As a precaution against this kind of thing I always watch the wheels of parked vehicles for movement and I always rest a thumb on the horn. So I see trouble brewing, honk as soon as the other vehicle starts to move and change lanes. The driver of that SUV neither saw me coming nor responded to the horn. The only reason we didn't have a T-bone collision was because of that lane change. I skirted around it with about a foot and a half to spare. It wasn't the closest call I've ever had, but it was the online where I was responsible for another person. I would have known to leap off the seat just before impact, but the passenger wouldn't. It turned out later he didn't even realize we'd nearly been in an accident, probably because his head was turned to enjoy the ocean view. The laws of physics made that swerve especially difficult, because I'm a slender woman. The passenger weighed 40 pounds more than me. Not necessarily a second later, more like a few seconds earlier, but whatever. I worked at a private gun range for almost a decade, and had one encounter where I could have nearly gotten killed. I was in what we called a trap house, a little bunker that holds a machine that throws clay targets for people to shoot. When we go into said bunker, we put a giant traffic cone on top of it that basically tells people there's someone in there. Keep your shotguns at your side unloaded and wait for them to exit. One day I was fixing some issues with the machine and was about to exit. I realized I left my bowl on the back shelf and stepped back and grabbed it. The second I did, I hear a shell go off and the cone on top of the house gets obliterated and falls in front of me. Turns out one of our members had his daughter there and was teaching her how to trap shoot. He didn't realize she loaded a shell when he was teaching her how to aim, irrelevant cause his gun shouldn't have been pointed downrange. He lost his membership over that incident. TL drive. If I didn't forget my bowl on a shelf, I would have stepped out of a bunker and had my head blown off by a shotgun wielded by an 8-year-old girl. I was swimming with my dad and my younger brother in a lake. We had one of those decent sized blow up rafts that we brought out to play around on. I thought it was cool to swim underneath the raft and surface on the other side. Well, the third time I tried this, my little brother jumped into the raft and his body slammed into my head while I was swimming underneath, completely disorienting me. I remember just inhaling tons of water and trying to figure out which way was up, and every time I tried surfacing I'd hit the bottom of the raft and become disoriented again. I could feel myself starting to black out before I pulled myself up around the side of the raft. No one even knew anything was wrong until I started heaving up water and coughing. Similar to this, when I was around 8 I didn't know how to swim very well and was at my grandmother's neighbor's home playing in Thedger pool with a friend my age. Accidentally stepped out of the shallow end and slid into the deep end, and remember just sitting at the bottom staring up at the surface and starting to black out. Friend's mother dove in and saved me. Still love water though. 10 would swim under blow up raft again. My story is a second earlier and I would have died. Basically I got T-boned by a van while riding my bicycle. Missed me by a couple inches, destroyed the back of the bike, and threw me into traffic. I had a similar experience a second earlier and it would have been bad. My dad and I were coming home from getting some stuff from the pharmacy. We come to a stoplight and are talking about how he liked his new job significantly more than his old one. I wouldn't remember this convo if we didn't nearly die anyway. This conversation kept my dad from going through the intersection. As soon as the light turned green, we start to move forward, and all of a sudden this car comes blazing through the red light to the side of us, literally missing us by like a couple of inches. Straight up froze us, and my dad just kinda sat there for a moment or two. Naturally, I made a joke like, well, that cold gone worse or something like that. In reality I know we cold both been seriously injured or killed, but I guess my way of dealing with the threat of death is to make jokes about it. Who knew? When I was learning to skydive I was trying to complete a level that involved turning 360 degrees clockwise and anti-clockwise in the air. First 2 attempts I could turn clockwise but not the other way for some reason. Cue the third attempt jump, and again clockwise goes like clockwork, if you'll pardon the pun, and so I try and turn anti-clockwise, but instead of going that direction or just not turning, like I had previously, I began to spin clockwise faster and faster and faster. I eventually span up to what I worked out to be 200 RPM, pulling about 15 grams. I could feel myself blacking out and my arms being forced outwards, but instead of pulling, when I started spinning, like I was supposed to, I kept fighting it and making it worse and instead looked at my altitude and pulled when I would have done normally. Had I kept going and not pulled and blacked out I could definitely have died from being tangled in my reserve. The spinning also caused all the capillaries in my eyes to burst, and so I looked like the devil for 2 weeks. I passed out at work and came around in the hospital. They diagnosed a bleed on the brain and eventually decided to drill a hole in my skull to drain the fluid. Just as they were about to put me under, the phone rang. It was the head of neurology. I actually had a burst aneurysm. According to my doctor, I would have probably been dead seconds after they started the surgery. If you don't mind, could you explain to me as to why you old died? Sorry, I don't know much about this kind of stuff. They drill holes in your skull to prevent your brain from being squeezed against your skull, since that can lead to brain damage. However, if you have an aneurysm, that action can prevent proper blood flow to your brain due to a drop in blood pressure in the brain tissue, starving your brain of oxygen, killing it. And while this doesn't have to be a problem, you can transfuse blood to keep oxygen flowing into the brain. Noticing that such a transfusion is needed after drilling open the skull is a rather big issue, since brains don't really recover from oxygen starvation. When I was 5 or 6, we were on holidays in Australia. My mother took me to a beach that is known because it's safe thanks to a net system that doesn't let the sharks in. Well, when we arrived, the beach was empty, what was kinda strange, but we continued to have a beach day and we had a bath. My mother even swam from one point to another. After that, we were going to the car and some authorities saw us. They told us to not enter the beach because a family of alligators had entered in the water and it was really dangerous. Nice of them to have nets to keep the crocodile food from swimming away. Since this is in Australia, these would be saltwater crocodiles, which are a lot stronger and bigger. As their name implies, saltwater crocs are found in salt water, although they also live in fresh water, which is not what their name implies, and it just goes to show how they cannot to be trusted. Saltwater crocs can grow up to 20 feet, although most just have 4. Got one. Rolled up over a small hill and signaled left. No oncoming traffic, so I drift to the middle of the road on a lazy North Main highway. Start to slow, and hear screeching brakes. Look to the rear view and only see grill of the pulp truck that just barreled over the hill. Impact. My truck is whipped around until I'm basically driver door to driver door with this semi. We slide across the oncoming lane and my truck drops into the ditch, but the pulp truck keeps going. The back of the rig starts tearing up my hood, then hits the crossbar by the door. More shattering glass. The whole side of the car begins to crumple towards me like a tin can. Can't tell if it's real time or I'm going to die slow-mo. Trailer and what's left of my truck stops about 8 inches from my face, chest, breath and exit with almost no injury. Holla fucking shit. Spelling. As someone who lived in Maine for a while, I narrowly avoided too many speeding log pulp trucks crossing main routes to even think of this happening.